So, good evening everyone. I am Erica Pani. So, next topic that I will discuss is which is better, current dividends or growth. So, we saw in the preceding section that a firm can pay a higher current dividend by increasing its payout ratio, but that will lower its dividend growth rate. So, the firm can provide a relatively high current dividend or a high growth rate, but not both. So, in this being the case, which would stockholder prefer? So, the answer is not clear. So, as we will see in chapter 15, some stockholder prefer current dividends while others prefer a lower payout ratio and future growth. So, empirical study have been unable to determine which strategy is optimal for maximizing a firm's stock price. So, dividend policy is an issue that management must decide on the basis of its judgment, not a mathematical formula. So, logically, the shareholders should prefer for the company to retain more earnings. Kaya naman, nagbabayad lang sila ng less current dividends. So, if the firm has exceptionally good investment opportunities. So, however, shareholders would prefer also a high payout if the investment opportunities are poor. In spite of this, the taxes and other factors complicate the situation because dividends have 8 taxes. So, we will discuss all this in detail in chapter 15. But for now, just assume that the firm's management has decided on a payout policy and uses that policy to determine the actual dividend. So next is the required condition for the constant growth model. So several conditions are necessary for equation 9.2 to be used. So first, the required rate of return must be greater than the long run growth rate. So if the equation is used in situation where the growth rate is greater than the rate of return, so the result will be wrong, meaningless, and misleading. So for example, yung last example ni Ira, which is the growth rate is 10% and the required rate of return is nag-exceed ng 9.0%. So the stock price as calculated by the equation 9.2, so the result would be negative $110. So that would be nonsense because the stocks cannot have the negative prices. So moreover, the table 9.1 na pinakita kanina, the present value of each future dividends would exceed that of the prior year. So second is the constant growth model as expressed in equation 9.2 is not appropriate unless a company's growth rate is expected to remain constant in the future. So this condition almost never holds for new startup firms, but it does exist for many mature companies. So indeed, mature firms such as Keller, Allied, and GE are generally expected to grow at about the same rate as nominal gross domestic product. So given example is real GDP plus inflation. So on this basis, one might expect the dividends of an average or normal company to grow at a rate of 3% to 6% a year. So note too that the equation 9.2 is sufficiently general to handle the case of a zero growth stock. So the zero growth stock is a common stock whose future dividends are not expected to grow at all. That is, the growth rate is equal to 0. So equation 9.2 reduces to equation 9.5, which is the market price is equal to the dividend over the rate of return. So this is the same equation as the one we developed in chapter 5 for a perpetuity, and it is simply the current dividend divided by the required rate of return. So finally, as we discussed later in the chapter, most firms, even the rapidly growing startups and others that pay no dividends at present, can be expected to pay dividends at some point in the future, at which time the constant growth model will be appropriate. So for such firms, equation 9.2 is used as one part of a more complicated valuation equation that we discussed next. So next is valuing non-constant growth stocks. So for many companies, it is not appropriate to assume that the dividends will grow at a constant rate. Indeed, most firms go through life cycles where they experience different growth rates during different parts of the cycle. So in their early years, most firms grow much faster than the economy as a whole. So then they match the economy's growth, and finally they grow at a slower rate than the economy. So automobile manufacturers in the 1920s, the computer software firms such as Microsoft in the 1990s, and Google in the 2000s are examples of firms in the early part of their cycle. So these firms are defined as supernormal or non-constant growth firms. So a supernormal non-constant growth is the part of the firm's life cycle in which it grows much faster than the economy as a whole. So in figure 9.3 illustrates the non-constant growth and compares it with normal growth, zero growth, and negative or declining growth. So in this figure, the dividends of the supernormal growth firm are expected to grow at a 30% rate for 3 years, after which the growth rate expected to fall to 4%, the assumed average for the company. So the value of this firm's stock, like any other asset, is the present value of its expected future dividends as determined by equation 9.1. When the dividend at a time is growing at a constant rate, we can simplify equation 9.1 to equation 9.2, which is the market price is equal to the first year of dividend divided by to the rate of returns minus the growth rate. So in the supernormal case, however, the expected growth rate is not a constant. So in our example, there are two distinctly different rates because equation 9.2 requires a constant growth rate. We obviously cannot use it to the value stocks that are not growing at a constant rate. However, assuming that a company currently enjoying supernormal growth will eventually slow down and become a constant growth stock, we can combine equation 9.1 and 9.2 to construct a new formula, which is the equation 9.6 for valuing the stock. So first, we assume that a dividend will grow at a constant rate, generally a relatively high rate for the end periods, after which it will grow at a constant rate growth and is often called the horizon or terminal date. So horizon terminal date is the date when the growth rate becomes constant. So at this date, it is no longer necessary to forecast the individual dividends. So second, we can use the constant growth formula, equation 9.2, to determine what the stock's horizon or continuing value will be the end periods from today. So, the horizon continuing value is the value at the horizon date of all dividends expected thereafter, which is the horizon value is equal to the dividend and the number of periods plus 1 over the rate of returns minus the growth rate. So, the stock intrinsic value today is the present value of the dividends during the non-constant growth period plus the present value of the horizon value. So to implement equation 9.6, we go through the following 3 steps. First is find the present value of each dividend during the period of non-constant growth and sum them. Second is find the expected stock price at the end of the non-constant growth period. So at this point, it has become a non-constant growth stock, so it can be valued with a constant growth model. So discount this price back to the present. So third is add these two components to find the stock intrinsic value. So the figure 9.4 illustrates the process of valuing non-constant growth stock. So here we use a new company, which is Firm M, and we assume the following information. So RS is a symbol for stockholders' required rate of return. So it is equals to 9%. So this rate is used to discount the cash flow. So the N is the number of years of non-constant growth is equal to 3. Then the growth rate is GS is the rate of growth in both earnings and dividends during the non-constant growth period, 10%. So this rate is shown directly on the timeline. So note that the growth rate during the non-constant growth period could vary from year to year. Also, there could be several different non-constant growth periods. The example given is 10% for 3 years, 8% for the next 3 years, and a constant 4% thereafter. So, GS is the rate of normal constant growth after the non-constant period is equal to 4%. So this rate is also shown on the timeline after year 3 when it is in effect. So T0 is the last dividend the company paid is equal to $1. So the valuation process diagram in this figure is explained in the steps set forth below the timeline. So the value of the non-constant growth stock is calculated as $24.43. So note that in this example, we assume a relatively short for 3 years horizon to keep things simple. So when evaluating stocks, most analysts use a longer horizon. The examples given is 10 years to estimated intrinsic value. So this requires a few more calculation, but because analysts use spreadsheets, the arithmetic is not a problem. So in practice, the real limitation is obtaining reliable forecasts for future growth. So these are the steps to calculate non-constant growth. So step 1, calculate the dividends expected at the end of each year during the non-constant growth period. Calculate the first dividend. So the first dividend is equal to the dividend times 1 plus the growth rates is equal to $1 times 1.10 is equal to 1,000. So here, the growth rate is the growth rate during the 3-year non-constant growth period by 10%. Show the 1,100 on the timeline as cash flow at time 1. So to calculate the second dividend is equal to the first dividend times 1 plus growth rates is equal to 1,100 times 1.10 is the total of $1,200. So then the third dividend is equal to second dividend times 1 plus the growth rates is equal to 1,200 times 1.10, the total of 1.3310, and so on. So show these values on the timeline as the cash flow time 2. Time 3, note that the dividend is used only to calculate the number of dividends. Next is step 2. So the price of stock is the present value of dividends from time 1 to infinity. So in theory, we could project each future dividend with a normal growth rate that is equal to 4% used to calculate D4 and subsequent dividends. However, we know that after D3 has been paid at time 3, so the stock becomes a constant growth stock. So therefore, we can use the constant growth formula to find P3, which is the present value of the dividends from time 4 to infinity as evaluated at time 3. So first, we determine the dividend 4 is equal to 1.3310 times 1.04 minus 1.3842. So for using the formula, then we calculate P3 as follows. So this is the calculation of getting the P3. So we show this the total of 27.6848 on the timeline as the second cash flow at time 3. So the 27.6848 is a time 3 cash flow in the sense that the stockholder could sell the stock for 27.6848 at time 3, and in the sense that 27.6848 is the present value of the dividend cash flow from time 4 to infinity. So note that the total cash flow of time 3 consists of the sum of D3 plus P3. So it is equal to 1.3310. So pag-add mo lang siya. So the total of 29.0158. So next step 3. Ngayon meron na tayong cash flow, and so we can discount each cash flow at required rate of return, which is 9%. So by discount each cash flow, di-divide lang natin siya by 1.09, where T is equal to 1 for time 1, T is equal to 2 for time 2, and T is equal to 3 for time 3. So this produces the present values shown to the left below the timeline, and the sum of the present value is the value of the non-constant growth stock, which is $24.43. So with the financial calculator, makikita nyo dun yung PV of the cash flow as shown on the timeline with the cash flow CFLO. Register your calculator, then enter 0 for CF0 because you received no cash flow at time 0. So the cash flow 1 is equal to 1.10, cash flow 2 1.21, and plus is cash flow 3 is 1.3310. Pa-flash lang yung dalawa. So 1.3310 plus 27.6848 is equal to 29.0158. So then enter 1 per year is equal to 90 and press the NPV key to find the value of the stock which is total of $24.43. So next is evaluating stocks that don't pay dividends. So the discounted dividend model assumes that the firm is currently paying a dividend. Pero sinasabi dito, meron daw mga firms, even yung mga highly profitable ones is including Google, hindi siya nagbabayad ng dividend. So if a firm is expected to begin paying dividends in the future, so we can modify the equation presented in the chapter and use them to determine the value of stock. So a new business often expects to have low sales during its first few years of operation as it develops its product. Then, if the product catches on, sales will grow rapidly for several years. So, the sales growth brings with it the need for additional assets, which is a firm cannot increase sales without also increasing its assets. And asset growth requires an increase in liability and or equity accounts. So the small firms can generate obtain some bank credit, but they must maintain a reasonable balance between the debt and equity. So those additional bank borrowings require increases in equity, and getting the equity capital needed to support growth can be difficult for small firms. So they have limited access to the capital markets, and even when they can sell common stock, their owners are reluctant to do so for fear of losing voting control. So therefore, the best source of equity for most small businesses is retained earnings. So for this reason, most small firms pay no dividends during their rapid growth years. Eventually, though, successful small firms to pay dividends, and those dividends generally grow rapidly at first but slow down to a sustainable constant rate once the firm reaches maturity. So if the firm currently pays no dividends, but it is expected to pay future dividends, the value of its stock can be found as follows. First is estimate at what point dividend will be paid. So the amount of the first dividend, the growth rate during the supernormal growth period, the length of the supernormal period, the long run or the constant growth rate, and the rate of return required by investors. So second is using the constant growth model to determine the stock price after the firm reaches a stable growth situation. And the last is set out on a timeline the cash flow or the dividends during the supernormal growth period and the stock price once the constant growth state is reached. Then find the present value of these cash flows. So that present value represent the value of the stock today. So to illustrate this process, consider the situation for Marble Lure Incorporation, a company that was set up in 2017 to produce and market a new high-tech fishing lure. So the Marble Lure Company expects to experience a high but declining rate of growth in sales and earnings during the next 10 years. So after which analysts estimate that it will grow at a steady 10% per year. So the firm's management has announced that it will pay no dividend for 5 years, but that if earnings materialize as forecasted, it will pay of $0.20 per share at the end of year 6, and $0.30 in the year 7, $0.40 the year 6, and so on. And after year 10, current plans are to increase dividends by 10% per year. So the Marvel Lures investment bankers estimate that investor requires a 15% return on similar stocks. So therefore, we find the value of share of Marvel Lures stock as follows. So ito yung computation. So the last term finds the expected stock price in year 10 and then finds the present value of that price. So those we see that discounted dividend model can be applied to firms that currently pay no dividends, provided we can estimate future dividends with a fair degree of confidence. However, in many cases, we can have more confidence in the forecast of free cash flow, and in this situation, it is better to use the corporate valuation model. So next is the enterprise-based approach to valuation. So thus far we have discussed the discounted dividend model for valuing a firm's common stock. So this procedure is widely used, but it is based on the assumption that the analyst can forecast future dividends reasonably well. So this is often true for mature companies that have a history of steadily growing dividends. However, dividends are dependent on earnings, so a reliable dividend forecast must be based on an underlying forecast of the firm's future sales, cost, and capital requirements. So this recognition has led to an alternative stock valuation approach, which is the corporate valuation model. So the corporate valuation model is a valuation model used as an alternative to the discounted dividend model to determine a firm's value, especially one with no history of dividends or the value of a division of a larger firm. So the corporate model first calculates the firm's free cash flow, then finds their present values to determine the firm's value. So to find a uh, free cash flow, so this is the formula, which is free cash flow uh, is equal to the earnings before the interest and tax times 1 minus time plus the depreciation and amortization minus the capital expenditure plus the net operating working capital. So the EBIT is earnings before interest and taxes, and free cash flow represents the cash generated from current operation less the cash that must be spent on investment in fixed assets and working capital to support the future growth. So next is the corporate valuation model. So in chapter 3, we explained that a firm's value is determined by its ability to generate cash flow both now and in the future. So therefore, the market value of a company's operation can be expressed as follows by this equation. So which is market value of company's operation is equal to uh, the, va- the value of a company's operation and the present value of expected future free cash flow, which is equal to the free cash flow, the first free cash flow over the 1 plus weighted average cost of capital plus the second free cash flow, then so on. So ipag-add mo lang siya lahat. So here FCF is the free cash flow in year time and the discount rate. So the WACC is the weighted average cost of capital, where when thinking about the WACC, note these 2 points. So first is the firm finances with debt, preferred stock, and common equity. So the WACC is the weighted average of these three types of capital, and we will discuss it in detail in chapter 10. So second is the free cash flow is the cash generated before any payments are made to any investors. So it must be used to compensate common stockholders, preferred stockholders, and bondholders. So moreover, each type of investor has a required rate of return, and the weighted average of those return is the WACC, which is used to discount the free cash flows. So the free cash flow are generally forecasted for 5 to 10 years. So after which it is assumed that the final explicitly forecasted future cash flow will grow at some long-run constant rate. So once the company reaches its horizon date, when cash flow begins to grow at a constant rate, we can use the following formula to calculate the market value of the company's operation as of that date, which is the horizon value is equal to the value of the company's operation at the time and equals to the future cash flow, the n plus 1 divided by the weighted average cost of capital minus the growth of rate of free cash flows. So in addition to their operating assets, some companies may also have significant non-operating assets that are not captured in the estimated free cash flows. So these non-operating assets should be included as part of the company's total corporate value. So examples may include large holdings of excess cash, real estate holding outside of its main operations, or a company's minority stake in another business. Consequently, the overall market value of the company can be estimated as this equation. So next is the comparing the corporate valuation and the discounted dividend model. So the analysts use both the discounted dividend model and the corporate valuation model when valuing mature. So the dividend paying firms and they generally use the corporate model when valuing divisions and firms that do not pay dividends. So in principle, we should find the same intrinsic value using either model, but differences are often observed. So when a conflict exists, the assumption embedded in the corporate model can be re-examined, and once the analyst is convinced the result of that model are used. So in practice, intrinsic value estimates based on the two models normally deviate from one another and from actual stock prices, so leading different analysts to reach different conclusions about the attractiveness of a given stock. So the better the analyst, the more often his or her valuation turn out to be correct. So no one can make perfect predictions. However, because too many things can change randomly and unpredictably in the future, given all this, does it matter whether you use the corporate model or the dividend model to value stocks? So the other approaches to valuing common stock. So although the dividend growth and the corporate valuation model presented in this chapter are the most widely used methods for valuing common stock, they're by no means that the only approaches. So the analysts often use a number of different techniques to value stocks. So three of these alternative approaches are described here. So first is the P-E multiple approach. So this approach depends on reported accounting earnings. Some analysts choose to rely on other multipliers to value stocks. Like for example, some analysts look at the company's price to cash flow ratio, whereas others look at the price to sales ratio. So next is the enterprise-based multiples approach. So other analysts like to focus on broader multiples that are based on company's enterprise value to EBITDA ratio, or the EBITDA. So recall from chapter 4 that the company's enterprise value is calculated in this equation. So the last is the EVA approach, or the economic value added approach. So this approach requires that analysts forecast when the stock will begin paying dividends, what the dividend will be once it is established, and what the future dividend growth rate will be. So in many cases, these forecasts contain considerable errors. So an alternative approach is based on the concept of the economic value added, which we discussed in chapter 3 and in the chapter 4 box, economic value added versus the net income. So that can be written as follows, which is the economic value added is equal to the equity capital times the ROE minus the cost of equity capital. So this equation suggests that companies can increase their economic value added by investing in projects that provide shareholders with returns that are above their cost of equity capital. So which is the return they could expect to earn on alternative investment with the same level of risk. So next is the preferred stock. So preferred stock is a hybrid. It is similar to a bond in some respects and to common stock in others. So this hybrid nature becomes apparent when we try to classify preferred stock in relation to bonds and common stock. So like bonds, preferred stock has a par value and a fixed dividend that must be paid before dividends can be paid on the common stock. So however, the directors can commit or pass the preferred dividend without throwing the company into bankruptcy. So although preferred stock calls for a fixed payment like bonds, skipping the payment will not lead to bankruptcy. So as noted earlier, a preferred stock entitled its owner to regular fixed dividend payments. So if the payments last forever, the issue is a perpetuity whose value is found as this equation. So which is VP is the value of the preferred stock, while DP is for the preferred dividend and RP is the required rate of return on the preferred. So for example, Allied Food has no preferred outstanding, but discussions about such an issue suggested that its preferred should pay a dividend of $10 per year. So if its required return was 10.3%, the preferred value would be 97.09, found as these computations. So in equilibrium, the expected return must be equal to the required return. Thus, if we know the preferred current price and dividend, we can solve for the expected rate of return in this equation. So that's all. Thank you for listening.